Hello, welcome to Oh What a Lovely Podcast, where popular culture meets the First World War. Today, Jessica, Chris and I are now joined by now regular of the show, Anne Marie Einhaus. Today we're going to be discussing Robert Graves' short story, Christmas Truce. It appears in the Penguin Book of First World War Stories, which is edited by Anne Marie. I think it's published in the early 1960s, the short story, Christmas Truce. It tells the story of an old First World War veteran recounting the brief moments of humanity shared with German soldiers in 1914 and 1915, when enemies met peacefully in no man's land. His memories reveal comradeship that transcended propaganda, yet also the brutality that soon reasserted itself. This is all framed by a conversation with his idealistic grandson in the early 1960s. The story contrasts youthful faith in the anti-nuclear movement with the veteran's hard-earned scepticism. The old man believes that goodwill alone cannot halt conflict, and that fear, not sentiment, may be the only force restraining catastrophe. I'm not sure if that's is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I think so. Pretty comprehensive. I feel compelled, first thing though, to say that the main editor of the Penguin Book of First World War Stories is my then MA supervisor, Barbara Korte, who's a short story expert and who incidentally suggested to me the topic of my PhD, which was First World War short stories. So shout out to her, but I accept culpability for some of the probably pretty terrible endnotes, explanatory notes. As I was saying earlier in our pre-discussion, I was but a 24-year-old, not well-versed in all things First World War yet.
I couldn't find when the Christmas Truce was published, other than vaguely the 1960s. Do we know?
Yes, I mean, this is in the explanatory note, but they might not have been so obvious in the Kindle edition. So let me just double-check the work of Anne Marie almost 20 years ago. So the earliest publication we could find was in the Saturday Evening Post, interestingly, but it was called something else. It was called Wave No Banners, which perhaps gives us a bit more of an idea of the political slant of the story. And that was on the 15th of December, 1962. And then it appeared in Graves's collected short stories in 1965. It's possible that it might have been published earlier somewhere else, but it's notoriously difficult to figure out the first magazine publication of any story, just because, the records are patchy.
So it's actually published like less than 2 months after the Cuban Missile Crisis.
And certainly written before the backdrop of at least the run-up of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
And do we know when it was republished in 1965? Had it changed its name by then?
I think it was then Christmas Truce in the collected stories, but I would have to go back and double check. Annoyingly, that note didn't make it into the notes.
Because the backdrop to the story is the young Stan trying to get his granddad to go on the anti-war march. I hadn't really joined the dots that it's there in the backdrop to the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah, and I mean, it is set in Britain. I did have a quick look last night just to see when the big march to Trafalgar Square happened, and I think there were at least two, one of which I think happened in 1959, and then the other one in 1960. There might be more. I mean, it's quite interesting coming back to this right now, because obviously in the last few years since 2022, we've had a bit of a revival of fears about nuclear annihilation, I suppose. A joyful topic for Christmas, as ever.
Always good to break out the greatest hits.
And also because quite recently I went to see a brilliant exhibition up here in the National Museum of Scotland on Cold War Scotland, which I'm going to say it right out, kind of revived my childhood fears around Chernobyl, very much so. And remembering, the not the literal fallout, the emotional fallout from that, not being allowed to play in sand pits, not being able to eat fresh mushrooms for ages. Obviously a slightly different experience probably in Germany compared to here. But yeah, that was brilliant, and had lots of, the CND campaign materials, from just on the ground campaigners who were involved in that in Scotland, and a whole, I think, observation post. I forget the name of the service looking out for possible nuclear attacks. And I hadn't realized up to then how many American bases were in Scotland.
I remember Chernobyl because we were told we'd never be able to eat sheep from the Yorkshire Dales again due to the fallout of it.
Interesting. So mushrooms for me, sheep for you.
Sheep for us.
I don't think that's how it turned out, is it? My feeling is that Yorkshire sheep still get eaten quite a lot.
And presumably European mushrooms.
It was the moral panic of the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
It feels a little bit like, whilst we're kind of on the topic of like the nuclear arms backdrop and CND, I can't remember what the previous one was, but where he kind of his shadow cast over the episode. It feels like AJP Taylor's lurking in the margins of some of this. I'm wondering the extent to which Robert Graves is also talking about historians using the First World War to talk about the Cold War, and the obvious one amongst those in the 1960s is AJP Taylor.
And I guess one thing that struck me again about the story is that, technically, and I guess especially if you consider the title in the Saturday Evening Post, Wave No Banners, kind of anti all the CND propaganda. But then we do have that lovely little bit at the end where actually, we're not so sure what Graves himself is actually thinking, because he uses Dodger, the friend, saying to Stan, well, who knows if we're right? Don't let your granddad dictate how you feel about this either. The jury's out,
Do what you think is right for you.
Exactly.
The story really revolves, the First World War part of the story revolves about sort of an organised truce, isn't it? But it's not, it's very organised. It's not kind of, it doesn't break out with men randomly going over the top. The officers organise this. It's sort of a professionalisation of the truce in 1914.
And I think, nowadays I feel as a First World War buff historian, you can't really read it without comparing it somewhat cynically to the delightful Sainsbury's advert of yore, which most people will have forgotten, but I'm sure is still vividly stuck in our memories. In fact, I used to teach the two together on my First World War Lit module. We'd sort of watch the advert and then compare it against the story. I think not only is it, a bit more officially organized by the officers and, kind of less spontaneously cordial, it obviously also on both occasions goes kind of wrong in that, the first time round it's kind of accidental and it's just a nasty, is it a brigadier? I forget, who's coming round, or general, who interrupts everything and, causes some shooting. And then the second time, and I think that's actually the bit of the story that for me has held up the least well. It's that nasty character who fires anyway, which, is just very unfortunately a very racist portrayal of a gypsy man. That was a bit of a downer, I have to say, rereading it. It's like, could it have done without the racism? That would have been nice, but hey-ho, of its time.
The German and French film was it Silent Night that came out? The plot of it maps very closely onto the plot of the short story, with the 1914 and the 1915 ones kind of coalesced, because that film ends with, I think it's a French soldier taking a pot shot, an angry French soldier taking a pot shot at the Germans in no man's land, and that's what dissolves the truce.
Instead of a conjuring clown, they have an opera singer delighting in the trenches.
Much classier.
It's of how the professional soldiers can organise this in 1914, this truce. But in 1915, you have those not conscripts, so you have these volunteers who are not professionals, and they're the ones excluded because they're the idealistically motivated troops that join, and they're incapable of understanding the truce between professionals, which is an interesting idea.
Yeah, it's really interesting that both of the narrators in the way are professional soldiers. They weren't in it just for the duration.
Just going back to the unpleasant racial element, and I agree with you about that, Anne Marie. But there's an element there, I think, of sort of a European professional soldier in particular that I think is coming across. Yes, I think you're right, Angus, about the idealism getting in the way, but there's also an element of not knowing what it is to be a proper soldier in all sorts of different ways that dissolves the truce. Whereas if it had been the right sort of soldier, maybe everything would have been And that's a very Graves sort of attitude to have. That doesn't surprise me coming from Robert Graves somehow.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a real, solidarity among the professional military class, and it becomes very clear that the British officer, Captain Pomeroy, I think, and Lieutenant Coburg on the German side, that they very much see eye to eye. They very much have the same view of the war, of how long it's probably going to last, and all the rest of it, as opposed to everyone else.
It's going back slightly to the framing because that was the thing that interested me. I'm currently writing about representations of ex-servicemen, and this is a brilliant one, or a couple of ex-servicemen, and the fact that talking to his grandson, sharing the story with his grandson, and that as a very natural framing, and this sort of idea that they never talked about it. Really, really.
And I guess the interesting class element as well, because several times he mentions that, Stan, who doesn't like to be called Stan, has come up in the world and, doesn't drink beer because it's too common, or he wants to be Stanley, not Stan, because it's too common.
Am I right in thinking that he's been at university?
He's at Polytechnic, which I thought was quite loaded in itself. He's not quite... he's a bit red brick.
Yeah. Although, a very thoroughly modern young man, who's sort of going into a clearly delineated profession. But I guess also in keeping with this idea of upward social mobility, he's not there yet. So he's not exactly been off to Oxbridge. He's going to the local Polytechnic.
I mean, and there's that lovely opening paragraph about having been Labour having got too damn respectable. There's all sorts of really interesting reflections on change over time between the end of the war and the 1960s, which actually has nothing to do with the Second World War, which I love. So I got very excited about. I'm really glad you sent us this, because it's now going into various bits of analysis I'm doing about representations of veterans. But then at the end, when he talks about men who've been wounded 3 times, 6 times, and Dodger being the only one who dodged all the bullets, although quite how he got the name Dodger before he dodged every single bullet is a little bit unclear. I found that a really interesting reflection on the status of ex-servicemen and their stories, and these stories, which when we think about the sentimentalization of the Sainsbury's ad, that's a different way in which the story has, was it 2014
so,
that
yeah.
ad came out? Yeah. Another 50 years on, and the story's mutated again. And it evolves over time.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because this story has a lot of the familiar elements that people now conjure up, but there are these little differences, even down to things like, now it's always portrayed as, which I think did happen. That we have evidence that it happens, but the idea of little Christmas trees being lifted out of the trenches, whereas he says, no, just Chinese lanterns, just those little differences. As a German, I'm really delighted by all the terribly misspelled, sort of phonetically rendered German words and phrases in this as well. Those were fun footnotes to write up.
But you're right in the sense that again, with most kind of Christmas Truce things, there's almost like a checklist you can kind of go down. So it's like decorations becoming visible, tick. People singing carols to each other across the trenches, tick. References to football, tick, and the like. And then, but it's the thing that I found most interesting about the short story is obviously, it focuses a reasonable amount on the 1914 truce, but it focuses on the 1914 truce as a delivery mechanism for talking about what he wants to talk about, which is the 1915 truce, which, he's saying is, this is the interesting one because it breaks down for XYZ reasons. And whilst we know that, there were often across the war and across various fronts at various kind of points, there were these kind of informal truces. I ended up doing a fair bit about them for my PhD, with the French and the Germans having truces. The idea that like, actually, let's look at Christmas 1915, because normally the view of it is that, as is in the story, the army tried really hard to crack down on it in advance to make sure that it didn't happen again, but also the sense that the will to do it had started to dissipate in 1915 and was definitely gone by 1916. There's a difference between having an informal truce where you don't shoot at each other just so you can have a quiet life, and going out and fraternizing in no man's land. And that desire to do so disappears as the war goes on, because it's difficult to go out and throw snowballs at the guy who's been throwing grenades at you for 364 days of the year. But that focus on, actually, let's talk about what happens as the next year, is a really kind of interesting and underlooked aspect of this kind of truces. 1914 swallows up all the oxygen in the room, whereas looking at an example which is probably fictional of 1915 is a really interesting one.
Yeah, and I guess Stan stands in for the beginning sentimentalization of all of this, and the idealism, as Jessica said initially as well. And I guess the story also comes at a point where we really see what we now think of as the popular memory of the war as, a futile tragedy properly emerging and making it into school curricula. The anti-war poets, even though we know they're not strictly anti-war, emerging in the syllabus and being taught and all the rest of it because of the Cold War and the fear around nuclear arms in some ways. So it's a really interesting point at which to revisit that experience for Graves and writing about it. I was just picking up on, as you were talking, on the very cynical statement towards the end of the story where the grandfather says to Stan, "Now listen, lad, if two real old-fashioned gentlemen like Colonel Pomeroy and Major Coburg, never heard of him again, but I doubt if he survived, having the guts he had, if two real men like them two couldn't hope for a third Christmas truce in the days when mankind, as you call him, was still a little bit civilized, tell me, what can you hope for now?" That strikes me as the ultimate disillusionment and also a bit of a diss on 1960s so-called civilization. So you can actually think back to it, and does think back to it as the good old days where, there was still some professional respect, at least, between soldiers on both sides.
Well, he doesn't have any faith in mankind. He doesn't believe in an inherent mankind faith, which is interesting. When you go back to that point about the Labour Party pre-First World War, there is that idea of international labourism where all the socialist parties agree not to go to war with one another before the war in a bout of internationalism, and then instantly all in patriotic favour go to war with one another in 1914. So it almost proves his point that Labour is not functioning and mankind doesn't exist, even throughout, for all its declarations of universality.
It's also remarkably close to Thatcher's "there's no such thing as society" thing in that thing. So, if there's no such thing as civilization, there's also no such thing as society. It is just humans being human or inhuman to each other.
So all in all, probably not the most heartwarming Christmas story.
He sort of points to peace being held by people's perhaps of certain cultures and backgrounds who can enforce authority to enforce peace, which is what happens at the Christmas Truce. The localised officers enforce peace because they understand what war is, unlike the brigadier who's not at the front.
Yeah, and I guess also it's about, that interpersonal element. It works as long as it's a small number of people who share some of the same ideas and background, but as soon as you try to scale it up, things break down. Even with the new volunteers who've joined for the second Christmas Truce, things break down. And so I guess one of the messages is you can't scale up these acts of goodwill, so to speak, to a societal level, I suppose.
And again, one of the things, again, as the tick box, is that the identification of the Germans across the trenches being Saxons. Whereas, we couldn't do this with the Prussians. They're insane. They want to kill everybody, but we're Saxons and we have this shared Anglo-Saxon element to it. So it's kind of also then the subdivision of groups within the various armies.
That's a recurring theme in short stories, because Sapper has one where he makes a very clear distinction between the nice Saxons. I think John Buchan does it as well at some point.
Exactly. I feel this is almost a callback to the last time I came to visit the podcast. I'm sure we talked about this, that Bavarians and Saxons are fine. Prussians, no, they're the devil. They're the proper militarists.
There's no such thing as society, that the sort of wider society. It's about the anxiety about the local community, isn't it? That it works when it is the PALS battalions. But then he makes the point that, what was it, right at the end again, is it 10,000? Before it ended, nearly 3 years later, we had 10,000 officers and men pass through that one battalion, which was never more than the strength of 500 rifles. So it's this idea of small communities with this enormous turnover. So you never get to know anyone. So, and it doesn't work at that level, which is the argument against Stan's mass rally. Because I've been reading about the 1919 Peace Parade for the thing I've been writing, that right at the start again, when he says, couldn't I persuade a few of my old comrades to form a special squad with a banner marked First World War veterans protest against the bomb? He wanted us to head the parade, ribbons, crutches, wheelchairs and all. So this idea of the big mass parade with this community of men as symbol, as sort of performative veterancy, if you will, versus the small community of the battalion, which isn't actually, by the end, the war's destroyed that. So it's a very small C conservative view of the destruction and futility of the war.
It's also interesting the things that he then identifies as being with veterans. You know, we want you to come along. You wear ribbons. You're old and you're wounded. So bring crutches, wheelchairs. That's who you are as a group. Which by the 1960s,
well, he has lost a foot. So presumably he's been on a crutch since 1918.
Yeah, but Dodger, on the other hand,
and yeah, that's true. I wonder how many men were in wheelchairs at that point. We're so used to that idea of the world wars seeing the veterans in wheelchairs now. But I need to go and look at some photographs from the 1960s to see what the visual iconography was, because presumably the men would still have been walking, most of them.
I guess it's a nice example of the veteran refusing to conform to how people have come to perceive them. And I guess also it strikes me that, he says he used to be a Labour man and now Labour has become too respectable. So presumably he still believes in those principles. But then it feels very counterintuitive that he's not also getting behind, an international movement for peace. So a nice reminder that people are complex and idiosyncratic and don't necessarily neatly slot into what we expect.
And also that Labour was a much bigger church. Yes, there was the unification of the workers for peace against and he talks about the war profiteers began treading us ex-heroes into the mud. That idea of peace being antithetical to capitalism. But before the war, it was about the dignity of labor, not necessarily. The peace movement was only a small part of that. So I can see how someone who doesn't become a pacifist might have been Labour at the time.
So for people who've not read the story, I guess the reason he doesn't want to join the anti-nuclear march is that he points to the fact that the use of gas was so horrendous that it prevented it being used in the Second World War, and the use of the nuclear bomb over Japan was so horrendous that the threat of it prevents it being used. So it's almost advocating for the big stick to keep the peace.
Mutually assured destruction. As Anne Marie says, it feels quite relevant. I was just talking about this with my son, who's interested in contemporary politics, which is terrifying.
Yeah, but it's amazing how once again, I think, 3 years ago, we were all incredibly worried. I remember talking to students who were incredibly worried. And, already you feel you've tamped it down again. And it's like, well, it hasn't happened yet. It hasn't happened yet. So it's probably going to be fine. I do think we have endless capacity to repress worries about mutually assured destruction.
And the kind of the counter argument to Stan I can't remember his name, Grandad argument that the threat of this will keep, as we know from our last episode, and again from historiography in the 1960s, is the First World War. The idea that these two massive alliances will impart the fear of God into the other one, and therefore nothing will happen, is Yes, okay, you can use that argument for mutually assured destruction, but the counter argument to it is the events of the First World War, where it doesn't work, as Blackadder so astutely commented in one of our recent episodes.
I guess the point the story is also making is that history never repeats itself exactly. It always finds new guises. So nothing is ever a sure predictor of anything in the future. And wouldn't it be nice if people picked up on this idea and not just we must study history so we're not doomed to repeat it, because we always seem to manage to find nice variations on a theme, don't we? I've got a fun little anecdote about this story from when I used to teach it as part of my final year module. And that's, I think in the second run maybe of that module, I had a student who had a note taker. And the note taker was, I would say back then in his mid to late 30s, and seemed to really get into the material. So I'd usually provide them with the reading in advance as well. And I could see it was really speaking to them. And then after the session where we discussed the Christmas Truce story, they came up to me and said, I think I recognize those people. I think, I used to be a lodger with Stan in the story and his family. And I remember them telling me that Robert Graves wrote a story about them. And I was like, wow, that is impressive. That's quite some claim to fame. So he didn't know the story before, but read the story and thought, oh my God, that must be what this guy was talking about. Robert Graves writing a story about him.
How does this fit with Robert Graves' sort of arc on writing about the war?
Not sure, because my interest in him is pretty much exclusively in his short fiction. So this is the only post-war, by a stretch, story of his that I'm really familiar with.
Well, I was slightly intrigued by the fact that Goodbye to All That's written in 1929, but it's heavily revised, was the phrase, in 1957. So presumably his First World War, certainly 1957, is still back on his mind. I wouldn't like to say fresh, but you know what I mean.
Doesn't he go off and stop writing about the war after Goodbye to All That?
That's my impression.
I have a feeling he disappears off to
Mallorca, I want to say.
Yes, I was going to say it's some Mediterranean island.
Yeah, and I think he just wrote his historical fiction, didn't he? Very successfully, and poetry.
He writes I, Claudius, and Claudius the God. Yeah, I think he meant goodbye to all that, quite literally, when he wrote it.
And maybe also looked across at Siegfried Sassoon and thought, well, he can't shut up about it, but I'll be damned if I go down the same route.
Yeah, I was just intrigued by the 1957. He pulls it out and re goes over it all. It's intriguing. And then he does this, and you think, I wonder why. Yeah,
I mean, you do wonder whether, I don't think it's exactly an autobiographical story, but I wonder whether there was an incident where a similar conversation happened with him involved that prompted this little story, or, one of his veteran friends told him this story. Clearly, there must be a grain of truth in it, given that someone recognized themselves in the story. So I suspect that, probably because it was that moment where, the poetry of Wilfred Owen and any anti-war sentiment was dredged up to shore up the campaign for nuclear disarmament, that, it came to his attention that way because it was in the zeitgeist, so to speak.
And it is a time when various other kind of First World War soldiers are kind of chafing a bit at the kind of the appropriation of their wartime experience.
57 feels a little bit early, doesn't it?
I mean, yeah, Carrington is. That might be later in the 60s, but I think it's bubbling under the surface for him. The use of the First World War to kind of...
Yeah, and I guess maybe also a sense, if we don't speak up now and set the record straight, then, it might be too late.
So I'm just going to see if I can find any sort of biography of Robert Graves about what happens in the late 1950s. So 57 just feels a bit early for a response to the Owen. When does Lewis's edition of Owen's poetry come out?
I thought that was in the 30s already.
The Blunden edition is,
right.
is 1929. C. Day Lewis comes, but I think it's 1962. I want to say something
I think it's 62 as well. Let me.
63
Yeah, yeah.
looks like it, yeah.
It's not quite clear from the publishing history and his professional history why the late 1950s would be the moment where he revisits his memoirs.
He was never satisfied with the 1929 edition, and he was also under financial pressures in the late 1950s.
Yeah, so probably, yeah.
So it was a moment to revisit it.
Presumably his publishers thought it would sell at that point. And that's quite interesting because, as I say, that feels just a fraction early for the real burgeoning of interest.
Yeah, although I guess it had been long enough since the end of the Second World War for people to feel that there might be some mileage again and people reading about war.
Oh, there's a tremendous amount of books come out after the Second World War in the 50s of memoirs from, I think, both wars, isn't there? It seemed to be another publishing boom for people wanting to read about the wars and understand their place in them.
I always get the impression that from the First World War, it sort of focuses around the 50th anniversary. So from, 62, but 64 onwards is really when you get the big, because publishers do like an anniversary to sell things, don't they?
Yeah. You've also got that thing, though, where there's so many high-ranking people who are writing books about the Second World War, are also writing about their First World War at the same time, because so many people come through. And they're the kind of books my father was obsessed with, because he went through the Second World War not having a clue what his war was, and I think he only understood his war in the decades that was after the war, because he had no idea what was going on. So do we have anything else to add? Do we have any closing thoughts?
Not sure it's the most cheerful Christmas episode we've ever done.
I feel I've led you astray by suggesting this story.
But I enjoyed it. It was a fun, interesting read.
Oddly, it came across as almost a fiction. It didn't come across as this is truth, if that makes sense. It came across as I am writing you an allegory, so don't expect this to be true.
Yeah, and that little undermining at the end as well, to say, well, make of it what you will. This is in a way neither here nor there. You should stick to what you believe is the best way forward.
So curiously, I felt it felt more Christmassy than a lot of the other Christmas Truth nonsense, which is way too sort of fluffy and like the Sainsbury's advert. This kind of has a note of caution to it, and perhaps, arguably a potential ring of truth.
Yeah, and I guess we still do have that sense of solidarity. It's just, it just makes it clear that that's always going to be limited and contingent on circumstances and who's involved. So I guess realistic idealism.
Yeah, that pace has to be imposed upon the men from the hierarchical class. So it's I think it's the vicar who organises the football, or the padre or somebody.
Yeah, he's refereeing it.
These are not kind of loosey-goosey things that happen. The hierarchical class structure, it allows the truce to function, which is an slightly odd take on it, rather than men just randomly coming out and the officers slowly follow.
But I think it does fit in with, something that I think we forget just how rigid and significant the class system was for most of the 20th century. When the story was published, and characters like Stan would presumably be kicking against the rigidity of that social hierarchy. But for Graves and his generation, it would have been absolutely natural.
And it's just an interesting crossover at that point it's so early in the 60s as well. For it to be, it almost felt as though it should be later in the 1960s that the book would be written, which is why I was slightly fascinated by its publication date. Very good. Thank you, Anne Marie. Chris, what are we talking about next time?
I don't know.
I do. We're talking about the choral, aren't we?
Oh, I have not yet been able to see it.
It's only just come out. It's on at my local cinema. So, yeah.
I mean, hopefully it'll come out on streaming services as well if the cinemas around here aren't showing it.
I'm going to go away and see if I can get to it this week because it's on at our local cinema.
I've been meaning to go and see it as well, but it's always the fear that it might really annoy you.
Well, I did get a review from a friend, which I'll save for the actual discussion. But
She's got to suspend your disbelief even more than you would otherwise. Well, very good. Thank you, Anne Marie.
Thanks for having me.
thank you.
Yeah, no, always a pleasure. Merry Christmas.
Yes, Merry
Christmas,
Christmas,
everyone.
everyone. Listen to the carol singers outside and all the Christmas things. All of us are surrounded by our Christmas decorations. You can't see them.
Well, I will say the temperature is finally to give a sense of when this is. There we go.
Yeah.
Already got
Anne Marie's
my
holding up
Christmas
some Christmas
decks.
decorations.
As I say, we have snow this morning.
And the temperature
Did you
is
have snow
finally-
this morning, Jessica?
Yeah. Heavy frost, but no snow.
A very light covering, so it didn't quite fit. It felt English Christmassy, sort of wet.
Yes. And I've just ordered our goose for Christmas,
Hey.
so you know.
As we
We're very
record this
good.
on the 25th of December, despite the fact it going out on the 1st of December, it's Christmas Day, everyone.
Very,
Christmas Day listening.
very good. Right, well, we'll see you all in the new year. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Oh,